Chelsea, hi.
Hello. Greetings from
And
Quantum World.
yes, yay! I'm so glad. And on our very first show, Chelsea had the foresight and the thought to say, I was just talking about this topic with a friend of mine. What do you think about inviting him? And I'm like, I love John. That'd be great. So, Mr. John Voelcker, journalist of many notes, Green Car Reports is where I know him from, but he's been I couldn't list it on two hands, could I? All the places you've written for.
Probably not. Although the 12,000 articles written or edited on Green Car Reports kind of outweighs the rest of it. But yeah.
12,000? Is that all?
I only wrote 5,500 of them.
Slacker.
Slacker. Exactly. Let's see, in a 25 cents
Okay,
per
boomer.
article, that means, it's already getting ugly.
I mean, come on. I've got like 10 or 12 to my name.
Yeah, well, no, and your blog is still up there, which I go back and refer to every now and then. Because it's kind of remarkable. Something you said in 2012 often still seems to be really apropos today.
Yeah, well, not that much has changed is actually what we keep discovering.
It's kind of sad, isn't
it? Sorry.
Well, should we just go into a rat hole right away and talk about the Bronco? No, we're not going to talk about it. Not right away, at least. Motivation for this was I had asked Chelsea if she thought that Tesla sales being what they were, does that disprove the notion that there is this pent-up demand by millions of Americans to buy electric vehicles if Tesla's only selling 100,000 or less every quarter?
Well, and of those 100,000, probably less than half are the U.S.
Correct.
Well, and to put it, so you didn't phrase it entirely that way. And I think on one hand, we have to acknowledge right up front, if you're starting from, does the fact that any company only sells 100,000 EVs every quarter, like we are all clamoring for any other company that wants to sell that many EVs in any quarter. So the way you phrased the question was, does the fact that their sales are potentially flattening say something about broader EV demand, which is very different than
Fair enough.
Only 100,000. God, if we can multiply that by all the incumbent automakers, we wouldn't need shows like these towards EV curious people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Suitably chastised, the host nodded modestly to his guest and moved along.
Yeah. I am always willing to be corrected where I make a misstep. But we are getting to a point, which is a good thing in history, where electric cars are no longer this freakish thing that someone only sees maybe once or twice a year or whatever. We're seeing electric cars slowly becoming a mainstream option for a choice.
And when we are allowed to travel to Europe or China, we can see that in public.
Right. Well, yes, exactly. So you're right, Russell, in a few places.
Yeah.
In a few places.
In Norway, in Amsterdam, in California, where we both are, in New York, where John is. I mean, John is always the best. Well, still a carb state, but what I would say that you are often the first to remind all of us is none of us live in America.
Yeah. There is that.
We are all in places where EVs are more common to see, not even quite a foregone conclusion the way like Norway, but go to Oklahoma, as I did in February, one of the last acts of travel before these times. And we stopped to charge in grocery stores and people come out of the market because it's the first EV they've ever seen. It's the first time they've ever seen anyone use the charger, etc. So we get mired in a little bubble to some degree, but we forget that there's a whole swath of the country for whom this is a very, very brand new thing. And even if they're interested, not that much is available there yet.
Yeah. But, okay. People who are EV curious, they sort of know that EVs are out there, I guess. Mm-hmm. They've read something about them. They've heard something about them. They've seen them on TV. Tesla. And they're sort of thinking that might be an interesting thing, although I'm not sure and I don't know. These guys? Okay.
And various stages of understanding, but haven't yet bought one, aren't the hardcore enthusiast types that we hear from on social media all the time in varying ways, that will send me death threats for anything I say about Tesla tonight, but also not the people who've never heard of an EV. So that sort of stage in the middle, some are very interested in the topics, and this one, like, are sales flattening? What does that mean for us? What does COVID mean for all of this? All of those things are fair game, but we're not
so
trying
maybe
to
on the front end of the theoretical mass market that's supposed to be out there one day.
Yeah, I mean, early adopters statistically go to like 13.5% or something. Early adopters, fast followers. So we are still so far off from mainstream, but that's what everyone's aiming for. So these topics are very much like, how do we get to mainstream? How do we appeal to some of those people, but not the laggards today? It's the fast followers and the early majority in it. Like, it's the expanding the circle point of view.
The neighbors of the late early adopters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so how do they normally buy cars? They go to they look online first, and then they go to dealerships. So
and even before that, they read guys like you talk about them.
Okay. Ideally, hopefully.
Very much so, though. I mean, that's the early influence, right? Unless they already have like a familial brand loyalty, which we know a lot of people do. They've got to see it in a magazine or read it online or see it on TV and get excited about it, and then maybe.
And the influencers as well, who are both the early adopters, and I think everybody in this room has been so you know about cars, I'm thinking of buying an XYZ, what do you think?
Yes. And I think that there's a difference between how do people buy cars and how do people come to EVs. So how do people buy cars?
Yeah.
The Bronco unveiling is a perfect example of that, where there is a wide swath of people who never would have thought of looking at that vehicle now going, oh my God, everyone's saying it's so cool. I should go look at that. And then they look at it and go, oh my God, that's so cool. And I kind of don't care. Like, cars are an emotional purchase. And that's not different with EVs, but EVs are never treated that way by the industry and the advertisers and whatever. So it ends up indexing more towards, who do I know that has one? And if somebody like me that has one works for them on my block or at my workplace or whatever, then I end up talking to them. And then it's much more interpersonal advice, as you described. So it's not all the same camp, but it feels like I know we have to yank EVs out of that appliance mindset on the part of the industry tasked with advertising them.
Are all EVs appliance? I'm sorry.
They're not, but they're treated that way in advertising.
Yeah, and I think, every EV owner right now, by definition, is kind of an influencer. And they're not talking about them in the appliance mode. Except for the small number of people who spreadsheeted it out and talk about the money they save in year 5. But
we're not talking about iMeet drivers. I can say that because I drove a Japanese one for 4 years and I still love that car.
Right-hand drive, if I remember. Yeah.
Yes, with snow tires in California. It was brilliant.
So tired. Well,
I didn't know there was no tires.
There's a story there.
I passed 2 separate first-generation Smarts on Interstate 87, the New York State Thruway. I was doing something, and they were doing less than something. But
we had
God
a
bless those people who are driving those cars.
March. Bob just finally got rid of his smart car.
Oh.
He got one of the first ones in the U.S.
Who bought it?
We did. Yeah, it was like.
No. Who bought it from him?
Oh, it got traded in.
Oh, all right. On the actual electric car.
Yes, our very first actual electric car that we own. Yes, a Smart got traded in for a Bolt, and it hasn't moved much since.
We will also not address the vehicle to household issue, thank God.
Wow.
Yeah.
But okay, so electric cars should not be viewed as appliances because that's not how people buy cars. People buy cars, as Chelsea, you've written for at least a decade.
Mostly you. Mostly for you.
People buy cars for emotional reasons, and they buy cars because they're going to make them feel good, they're going to make them look better, or they're fun. Hopefully all three. And also,
among others, yeah.
They do what the more sensible half of the couple requires them to do, like haul boxes or kids or engines on pallets or whatever it is. So all right, so here's the question. Why haven't we seen advertising to talk about how wonderful the Bolt EV is at doing all those things?
Why indeed? Why isn't GM spending money to advertise their, they did more Volt advertising before the car ever went into production than they've done since it came out.
Yes. Well, GM alone is a complicated topic and probably an episode unto itself.
Certainly.
But certainly as a broad, somewhat stereotypical, but I think fair on average statement, the core industry of automakers, incumbent ones, not the startups, are still rabidly ambivalent about doing this and mostly compelled by external regulation around the world, forcing them to do it, as has been the case since literally 1990. So they'll put cars out there to greater or lesser degrees of wanting to be successful. GM gets credit as one of the incumbents, I think, with Nissan, in terms of earliest adopters of incumbent automakers to high volume EVs, to wanting to make them successful to a point. Others are less interested, and we see what John and I started calling compliance cars many years ago, which is sort of the artificially limited stuff. So until automakers decide they want to sell the socks off any EV model, we see fairly crappy advertising. Often by design, sometimes by just not knowing better. And I talk to people inside automakers all the time that actually like the products that they're trying to sell, but they themselves think, oh gosh, they're so foreign to the market. We have to make them not scary and make them something that's understandable. And so they end up making them appliance commercials, not because they're trying to keep them down per se, but the end result is still the same. They can't imagine selling an EV like a car.
Yeah. And I would argue that part of the reason for this, certainly the automakers will tell you this, is that they only want to sell X amount. I mean, Chelsea, as much as I fought it, I've really come around to your point of view that pretty much everything that isn't a Tesla is a compliance car.
To varying degrees, in fairness.
But if you look at them globally,
yes.
A compliance car in China still has to sell hundreds of thousands of units because China has a few carrots and a whole bunch of really big sticks, and they want their industry to dominate. So, but, Tesla aside, when the automakers think they can start to make money on electric cars, that changes the equation. And there will be that break-even point. And that has to come with the, what's the word I'm looking for, where parity, where an electric car of a given segment with a given, cargo capacity and all the rest, with 250 miles or more in the US, sells for roughly the same thing as the gasoline version. When the parity arrives, automakers, I think, are going to see a couple of things. Number one, they can get rid of 30% of the people who build cars. It takes fewer people to build electric cars, and automakers sort of like that idea.
Sure.
Number two, there's interesting economies of scale in a very different way. GM said when they did their big hoopla, you and I were both at that.
Last time I saw you in person.
Yeah, really. Zoom just ain't the same.
No.
GM said several times, for all of the 12 or so vehicles they talked about and sold globally in different markets, different bodies, et cetera, I think they only had 18 powertrain configurations.
Only.
And that's all over the world. No, yeah. But that would be
compared to internal combustion,
it's
rapidly different. Yeah.
Yeah, between diesels and gasoline and plug-in hybrids, blah, blah, blah. So I think automakers are going to get to a point where they realize that as battery costs keep coming down, although Nissan, having introduced the Aria yesterday, obviously it didn't happen in 2015 when the now no longer jailed CEO of Nissan said it was going to originally. But when they start seeing that, which I think will happen in the latter part of the decade, then we will, I believe, get more interest from automakers. But again, China and Europe are going to lead the US, and the US is a tougher place to sell electric cars because they have to do more. We've got cheap gasoline, we've got incredibly dispersed, very low density suburbs we've been zoning and building for 70 years. We have no mass transit between city pairs. All of these things make people have to do more with their cars. So that's a slightly higher hill for electric cars. And I do think in the end, North America is really at risk of falling behind the rest of the world in terms of electric car technology.
And here's the part where I say I think you're optimistic. I totally get it on parity, and Bloomberg New Energy Finance is known now for putting out these EV outlooks and putting damp fingers in the wind of when these sorts of things will happen. And they've always pegged exactly the same thing. Parity of cost is not the same thing as profit and price. And I don't know that parity is going to be enough to get automakers to want to. So when it can kind of cost the same, yes. And I think you're absolutely right on bringing in sort of the lower overhead, although saying out loud the fact that they can eliminate jobs is probably not a popular thing.
They're never going to say that.
And the same thing, by the way, stands for dealers and always have, which is why they are not nearly as worried as everybody thinks about lower service revenue with EVs coming. They're like, great, lower overhead for us, smaller footprint, fewer techs, we're fine.
More than that, the tail on gasoline cars is going to last for the rest of the lifetimes
all
of the
of those things
person on
too.
this call.
Yes, and that's the other thing every dealer has ever said to me is like, this, I would be so retired, I don't even care. So
dealers are about weekly, monthly, quarterly, and in the long horizon, annually.
Yes,
So,
yeah, dealers are not fighting this as hard as everybody assumes that they are. Wanting to sell them is a different thing.
Yeah, but
yeah, when it's more imminent, it'll be interesting to see the dealer's reaction, because this is going to change them the most in a lot of ways.
Still not as fast as, like, what feels very fast to us is still so slow in the grand scheme that I promise you they do not care, and or at least they don't mind. Some of them are actively interested in starting to be, because they sort of go, yeah, we can make a business out of this. Others are like, yeah, whatever, these little EV things will do their thing, and it doesn't really affect me that much. Like, whatever happens, happens, but it does not impact my bottom line so much anytime soon. Maybe my kid will own this store one day and it might matter to him, but it's still the pace of things for any individual dealer is so slow in the deployment. And we're still talking about, we started this with, what if every automaker wanted to sell 100,000? Fine. Let's say that's 1 million cars, even entirely in the US, 1 million EVs every year, compared to 14, 15 million in a decent year, up to 17 in a good year, million cars sold total in this country. This is not rapid progress from a dealer's individual perspective.
Yeah, and one of the several things that GM said at the event we were at, which I remain to be convinced about, is dealers now are excited about electric cars because they're in all the brands and they're in several different segments and so on. It's like, I look forward to seeing that.
That's
always my version of bless your heart in the South. Bless your heart. My version for years has been, I look forward to seeing that about so many things. And as a category, I don't think they're excited. As a category, I don't think they're obstinate either. They're just kind of like, whatever, train us, pay us, spiff us to sell what you want, we'll sell it.
Oh, I was going to say, dealers will sell whatever makes them money.
Yeah.
And this drives all the way back to the point you brought up, which is that this is all still regulatorily driven. And China is most aggressive with regulation. And this is where I repeat something you've heard me say many times, my apologies. But China has had as government industrial policy for going on 20 years, they want to own the world's largest share of global production of photovoltaic cells. Done. They want to own the largest portion of lithium-ion battery cells in process. They're going to get there. They want to own the world's largest portion of electric car sales or production and sales. They're going to get there probably just because they have the largest auto market in the world. So, okay, great. That's China. My understanding was China and CARB kind of got together. China came to pick CARB's brains, and then they said, okay, great, we're just going to turn this up to 111.
Yes, there have been lots of brain picking on the other two regions. From CARB, there's also a lot of people visiting the Norway EV Association in recent years, and some of those guys. So yes, there's lots of that intel exchange, officially and not. So not all of them are sharing who all is coming to visit whom, but there is lots of that happening for sure. And certainly a hugely competitive sense on behalf of China. Like the others are not so competitive with regionally, other than a little bit of press release stuff. Mary Nichols cares about having something to stand on before she retires from the Air Resources Board, but China, very competitive industrially in a way that the other two are not.
Yeah. Are we too much in the weeds here?
No. Well, I was going to ask, just for the sake of people who aren't that much inside baseball, just explain briefly why Norway is such an EV-loving country. It's not by chance.
They have a lot of money derived from extracting fossil fuels from underneath the North Sea, but smartly, they put that money in a savings account, and I'm generalizing a bit, but they are using some of that money to transition away from carbon emissions in a wide variety of fields, including in automobiles. Their goal is not to sell any new vehicles with tailpipes by 2025. I believe that's restricted to sort of passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks. I don't know what they do about semis, but and they have a 12-year plan to enable that with a variety of incentives and penalties that come on and off as they go. And they're now at about 50% battery electric vehicle sales of new cars, I think.
And an extension of a happy accident, actually, because it all sort of spun off of an incentive that was established well before this generation of EVs, primarily on the tail end of the last generation of EVs, mostly to support local companies that were building these little 2 or 3 wheeled, kind of dorky. We talk about the iMev. These were more than that in terms of.
Think, was it? Where was Think?
Well, Think was involved as well, but Think by then, so Think started in Norway and got bought by Ford and was part of the sort of the CARB shenanigans that we covered in Who Killed the Electric Car. But there were others that made the Think look like a proper car. And so the original incentive of not having to pay tax, no value added tax that most of Europe and other parts of the world pay, EVs got to pass on all of those things, which made them kind of compelling. And they put this law in place to support these little EVs years and years ago. And then this generation came on long after anyone had forgotten, anyone remembered this was on the books. And EVs took off there. Exactly the same thing happened in Atlanta for exactly the same reasons. It was an EV incentive that was put on at the tail end of the EV1 generation. Plug-in hybrids weren't involved because they just didn't exist at the time. It was that early. And all of a sudden the market took off. And in Georgia, politicians said, oh my God, we got to kill this. And in Norway, they went, oh my God, what do we do with this? Let's run with it and see what happens. And here we are.
And they did a ton of other stuff. I don't know if I got a lecture about ferry fees were reduced and bridge tolls and all kinds of things. But they did actually adapt the happy accident of that into a decarbonization plan for transportation.
Right.
And the EU obviously is serious about decarbonizing transport. Obviously for North America, there's this big asterisk about what happens in November, because I have not dug into one of the candidates' climate plans. The other one doesn't seem to have one. So
he has one. It's just different.
Involved, yes. But I would imagine that there are any number of regulatory levers that could arguably have been pulled. And I think you and I know some people who in the background were writing some of those proposals.
Yeah.
The idea, obviously, of linking economic recovery and decarbonization seems like a sort of a politically smart one. I will be curious to see to what degree there are domestic content or made in America or made in NAFTA or whatever requirements in there, because Tesla, people do forget, is an American company and it makes its cars here. They're probably not bringing cars from China anytime soon. But, you know, the Nissan Ariya is going to be made in Japan and imported into the US, unlike the Leaf, which was at least assembled here. GM's cars will be made domestically. Ford is making its Mustang Mach-E in Mexico. Who am I missing? Rivian, if it gets cars out the door, say?
Volkswagen.
Volkswagen will import initially, and then they're going to make cars in Chattanooga. So there are some manufacturers that are set up, if that exists, to benefit, and others who won't. But
yeah, I mean, I'm curious about that too, but also, you know, it's a lovely slogan, but the vast majority of American cars haven't been very American, other than assembly, for decades. So
well,
the suppliers, like, depending on how far you dig, many more cars would be considered largely American and certainly, you know, the whole point of Buy American is supporting jobs. Let's face it. More cars would qualify for that than people would assume, based entirely on where they're produced.
It's all how you do the math. I had actually a lengthy discussion with someone we both know at Nissan about domestic content. And the challenge with electric cars turns out to be, okay, maybe you assemble the cells in the US,
right?
But where does the electrode film come from? Because that's 30% of the cost right there. And it came in big rolls from Japan.
Right.
So,
well, and that's exactly the point. So to the extent that the mission is decarbonization and deployment of technologies that enable that, I don't know that we should care that much in the near term where EVs are built. I care that they are available nationwide, not just California or CARB states, and that they are available in volume at reasonable prices and increasing variety. Like, there's no single gas car for everybody. We need, you know, more trucks and SUVs and variety, performance and prices and range, and all of the things that we look for in an internal combustion market needs to start to apply to EVs. But for the last decade or so, we've kind of had mostly compact-ish cars. And
hatchback's worse.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I like small cars, but I recognize that most of the buying market wants something bigger, or we have Teslas, or sort of like $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 cars. So we've had a very polarized availability, and mostly available coastally, and very little of anything available in the middle. So I care less right now where it comes from. I care that it gets here, is available, and someone buys it.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree completely. I was sort of commenting on the politics.
I know. I expect the same, but I think we end up having to encourage, whether as buyers or advocates, some of these things and establish priorities.
Well, but I think...
No, I was just going to ask, so do both of you think a Norwegian-style subsidy, an aggressive program to encourage Americans to buy an electric car, if that were instituted here, would it work? Or is that something that really only works in Norway for a number of reasons?
So I don't know that there's enough layers and stuff to the Norwegian and European, for that matter, tax system that I don't know that we could carbon copy. But the closest analogy that I tend to see is something that aims at a relatively cost-neutral fee-based system. So penalize the higher polluters, the bigger, uglier cars, and then give similar incentives to cleaner electric or hydrogen or whatever your priorities are cars. And so in the end, the dirtier cars pay and the cleaner cars get the incentive, and it aims to kind of meet in the middle. And that tends to be more politically popular in the US. So that's the closest analogy to the Norwegian system I would see.
I think France has a fee-based system.
There have been several that have been tried, and that's part of why it gets some palatability here, because you can point to it elsewhere and show that it's been successful, but also it doesn't tend to antagonize either political side as much.
One of the interesting tactics I am surprised no one has written about is that the head of PSA, Peugeot Citroën, now owners of Fiat Chrysler, which is
Oh, but no, now it's
Solaris?
Stellantis or something?
Stellantis, yes.
Stanley,
talk to your doctor about Stellantis.
If you observe any of the following side effects.
Yes.
So at least in France, they now incentivize dealers on lower tailpipe emissions, lower CO2 counts, basically. And all of a sudden, guess what? They're selling the lowest CO2 versions of every given segment.
It's like magic.
Yeah.
I started my career in this business selling cars, so all of this seems incredibly obvious to me.
And back to your question, Russ, yeah, if you think that we can get a program that basically gives a third of the price of every new vehicle up to, let's say, 60 grand, because the average price of a new vehicle sold is now over $38,000.
Yep.
So we're talking, let's say, somewhere between the $7,500 that it is now and $20,000 for each one of the 17 million vehicles sold in the US every year. If we can do that, we can get a ton of electric cars on the road. I wait for that. What was the phrase? I look forward to seeing that happen.
I look forward to seeing that. Yeah, I mean, and I would, even if you kept it where it is, I would love to fix that tax credit, as you know, in half a dozen ways. But so we started this question about, what is flattening sales of one company? Does it say anything? And like, how much should we read into any statistic? But what does it say about overall EV demand? And you, John, and I have talked about sort of this, like the EV fan base that insists that there are millions and millions of EV drivers pounding on doors of all the automakers. And in fairness, the automakers on the flip side that have uniquely treated EVs as different than every car and every retail product in requiring demand to predate and continually exceed supply. So on one hand, we have this fan base that's convinced millions want them. On the other hand, we have automakers going, yeah, when we see those millions, then we'll start to think about building them. But we shouldn't have to start beforehand. We shouldn't have to build our own market. We shouldn't have to actually do the advertising or put in infrastructure or do anything. The rest of the stakeholders should go do all these things for us, and then we'll think about showing up. And the answer is kind of in the middle, in that there is somewhat more demand than is currently being addressed, especially if you consider the non-carb areas and people that simply cannot get even the things that are available today. And yet we have to continue building on that. So that's the nut, is getting more automakers into the game, into putting, it's fine. If we're gonna have federal incentives, they should only apply to cars that are actually available nationwide, not this stuff that's only available on the places that we're all sitting in right now. And attaching strings to eliminating compliance cars, these things that are artificially limited, because all the industry complains there's no natural market for EVs, and yet there never will be as long as they're artificially limited by the industry with the vested interest in making or not making them.
And just to add the asterisk to your question, Russell, flattening sales of Teslas, it is worth looking at the fact that the globe has been in a pandemic for a chunk of Q1 and all of Q2, and auto sales were 40% of normal in April and 50% or something in May. I forgot what June was, but it's not like cars are selling per the normal clip anyway. So my take is basically, we can't judge in 2020 any of that because the external circumstances swamp any nuances in the market.
Right.
TLDR.
And the encouraging things about EV sales, the broader picture, is that there weren't many EVs that were going to be introduced. Like, this was always going to be a flat year for EV sales. Last year was, even though no one believed it until the third quarter, this year's kind of the same. It doesn't really start to get interesting in terms of EV introductions in any kind of volume until 21-2. So
this year had the Model Y, and that was it, basically.
Right, and to the degree to which the Model Y maybe cannibalized Model 3 or other sales is also TBD. So there is not enough information on a variety of fronts to really draw broad conclusions right now, but there are encouraging things in that there are cool cars coming in decent volumes from automakers that actually seem to want to sell them. And we'll see if they actually dig in and do it. But it feels like every conversation the last few months has been very similar in terms of trying to pull people back from making huge decisions based on super limited, mostly pandemic information.
Well, and I think we've all been asked, so what's COVID going to do to electric cars? And there were some maybe not terribly well thought through things that said essentially COVID is going to destroy electric cars. 5 years worth.
And no one will ever get on public transport again, by the way.
Right.
Even in New York.
Yeah. So my take after thinking about it and talking to people was COVID is not going to do any more damage to electric cars globally than it does to non-electric cars, some of which are also being delayed, postponed. The Germans have got to start trimming some of their insane model proliferation. And GM has already announced it's pushing a couple of mid-cycle updates a year further into the future, et cetera, et cetera. One of those was the Bolt EV, but then there were some gasoline SUVs as well. So electric cars being predominantly driven by regulation, the regulations aren't going anywhere.
Right.
German auto industry tried to get the EU and Germany to change or to delay the carbon emissions, and the answer was a resounding 9.
As it should be. And as a result, what we've seen, so one of the last introductions to actually get a fair amount of, EV introductions to get a fair amount of enthusiasm was the Ford Mach-E. And Ford is a company that has kind of been a mile wide and an inch deep for 15 or 20 years on the alternative fuel front. So they're very much we're looking forward to seeing that company in terms of reasonable volumes. But it looks promising, cautiously optimistic. And yet they said super early on, yeah, we're sending 60% at least of our volume to Europe because they actually have proper regulations. I mean, paraphrasing a little bit, that was the gist of the message. So you're absolutely right that unless and until the US gets its act together from a policy perspective, we have right now, the California Air Resources Board sort of fighting it out with the Trump administration's EPA, and it's all kind of TBD. And meanwhile, certainly the domestic manufacturers have mostly taken a step back and gone, yeah, we're going to wait and see how this plays out. Everybody else is still planning and trying to get ready to go faster, but not assuming anything until we have some answers. And then we have a couple states that have gone, yes, screw it, we're just going to join CARB. More states are signing up for the California plan just to try to get some sort of certainty.
And I think it's worth pointing out that among the domestics, if we have 2.5 domestic car makers, 1.5 of them don't sell in Europe anymore.
Right, exactly.
I mean, the company that is merging with Chrysler sells in Europe, but, Fiat, but, so it's not, GM's out of Europe completely. Ford it's a good thing Ford is Europe because China is not going so well for them. But to take what I have been beaten into saying, the Mustang Mach-E, and look at it, in terms of regulatory penalties avoided for Ford, is worth a lot more than selling it here. And even if you pay a markup, your dealer gets that, not Ford. And so Ford may lose X amount of dollars, but the amount that they would have to pay otherwise that they avoid paying in Europe makes that loss much more palatable and much more worthwhile, which is why your 60% will go to Europe.
Right. And why, to varying degrees, most of these are still compliance cars. That is basically the definition of compliance cars. We're going to sell what we have to sell to avoid whatever penalties in whatever region we're trying to avoid, and we're not going to try to necessarily sell very many more than that. Maybe a little bit of wiggle room if you want some basic credibility with the advocates, but that's about it.
That said, I will be curious to see what Ford has to say, or if they have to say anything, about who's actually buying Mach-E's. Are they Mustang fans who stopped grumbling about 4-doors and SUV and electric and un-American? Are they the traditional sort of electric car usual suspects, early adopters, yada, yada? Are they someone totally different? Is Ford getting people into buying electric cars who had not before? Because given the inadequacy of Ford's previous electric car efforts, I was grudging to say it, but I think making it a Mustang was smart, because in talking to them, it was going to be something a lot less interesting. It was going to be not only a compliance car, but a really uninteresting one.
Right.
So maybe it's a compliance car, but at least has marketing muscle behind it. Arguably the same thing for the Hummer. But for Ford and for GM, I think it's important to note that the new wave of electric cars coming in that 21 to 23 range is not going to be $30,000 affordable cars.
Right.
They're going to be pricey. They're going to be optioned up to the hill. But again, Bronco,
Right.
you know, that thing will be the same thing. You know,
For sure.
and it's how the domestics make money and raise their prices. The fascinating thing about sales figures during COVID, the trucks were going out the door at like 44 and 46 on average. The people with money were like, sure, I'll pay that. Yep,
Yeah.
here's a check.
Right. Yeah. And certainly there was a little bit of that early on sort of prepper trend. Like any inclination toward that got amped up a little bit. And I think that's sort of settling down a little. But to your point, EV sales are less likely to be affected because most of them coming out are aimed at people unaffected by COVID from a financial standpoint.
Yeah.
So that's going to remain fairly unchanged. And EVs, you know, we're not really getting into like really vehicle to grid conversations, but there's some resilience aspects to this technology as well that resonate with those that know about them and sort of think about, if it all falls down, I could power my house for a few days off my car. And even if I have to hack it together a little bit, those that want to will. And there's interest in that general, less subject to the volatility of gas prices and overall stability and keeping money in the local economy. There's a fairly strong conservative interest in electric cars that have always existed, but has kind of come and gone from visibility depending on the politics of the nation.
Well, and that's the thing, is that, you know, we've all written 8 years ago about the politicization and the identification of a technology with a political viewpoint that makes it toxic to the other half of the world.
For sure. But EVs were such a neocon thing up and until Obama put his name on the interest.
Yeah.
And then it became some weird left-wing Democrat thing.
I'll be very curious to see who buys Hummer EVs. I'll say that.
And
for sure.
But certainly, it's not the left leading the Tesla charge either at $75,000 to $100,000.
No.
Well, there are wealthy leftists.
Yes, there are.
But B, it's not environmentalist. Tesla owners actually index really low on green. They're early adopters on steroids, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. Well,
And
most
then there's
EVs
weird-
index really low on green. They're stereotyped that way, but it's never actually been true.
Yeah, well, that was absolutely. I think that the thing that makes Tesla such an outlier for me is they don't advertise, quote unquote, although traditionally
They market.
advertise.
They don't
Right?
advertise.
They market. You know, they don't have that dealer base. It's an American-made car, but again, it's super expensive.
But that's the traditional way that new technologies have always made it into automobiles. From the electric self-starter in 1912 that made gasoline cars practical, to automatic transmissions and disc brakes and turbos and everything else. It all comes in at the top, and it filters down, because auto companies and auto engineers are really good at taking complex electromechanical devices and making them more compact, easier, cheaper, and more reliable. That's what they do. And so I worry that we are overstressing the Prius example. And I could make the argument that Nissan followed the Prius example too much with the first generation Leaf. I get why you make an electric car smaller rather than bigger if batteries are expensive. On the other hand, Tesla did it the traditional way. You start with a $100,000 badly assembled, in England, 2-seat sports car. Then you go to the Model S and down the chain. I doubt they'll go much further down the chain. I can't really see Tesla as a brand making compacts. But, you know, Elon Musk, for all that everybody pictures him as a mold breaker, did the auto company the traditional way.
There's very little that Tesla has done that they were the first to actually do. There's an argument for them packaging a bunch of things well and doing certain things better than others, but shockingly rarely were they the first to try any particular element of most of what they've done.
Chelsea.
I'm going to get death
another 2 weeks
topic
Tesla re-education camp for you.
Send your email to. Oh no! Don't harass Chelsea.
Oh, it'll have like you don't need to.
Right, like they're going to listen to me. I'm like, I want to tell you how.
Yes.
I mean, Tesla gets credit for being all electric, for being mostly American made. I don't know what parts, if any, are made overseas that are shipped in to be assembled here. Does anybody have any clue as to the
Is
content?
Tesla making electrode film in Reno now? Do we know?
I do know.
I'm not sure. That would be the big piece. And, there's bits and pieces that come from other places, but no, it's largely American.
It's more vertically integrated than most.
Yeah.
Right. And that's always been one of their goals, to control that, or just to say that we do it.
Yes.
Whether it makes sense or not. I get them, but again, they're such an outlier in a lot of ways, which is why I kind of picked on them for the topic that I did.
Outlier
to a lot of double standards.
I mean, they've sold more electric cars as a company than any other company in the world. They have, I think that's right.
BYD? But yes, they're certainly in the top couple. No question.
Yeah. I'd have to go and look, actually. BYD isn't as big as I thought it was. But anyway, one of two.
Yeah.
Certainly in North America. They had the smarts to do a high-speed charging system properly, see that vision, and just roll it out. Still far better than any of the alternatives or all of them added together for everybody else's. And they're all in. So how are they an outlier? I would argue they're the biggest single piece of the business. If the business is electric cars, if it's the auto industry writ large, okay, they're an outlier, but is that what you meant?
I just like tossing things out there.
That was
a cop-out.
Yeah, that's a cop-out, yeah. I just put the straw man up so that you guys can knock them down artfully.
Oh.
Where's my blowtorch?
Yeah.
Do we think Tesla will be around 5 years from now? Do we think Tesla will be profitable 5 years from now? And do we think Tesla will be an American company 5 years from now? Go.
Yes. Maybe.
Yes, around, maybe profitable, maybe North American.
Yes.
Yeah, I would go with that too, just because there's a lot of change coming in the next 12 months. A lot of change, and we just don't even know economically.
God, I wrote that article in 2014 and again in 2017.
Right. Yes, that's always been the case. But yeah, in fairness, Tesla, huge success. Let's not pretend otherwise. Certainly an outlier. They're not the first, as an all-electric company, same thing, not the first. There's been a million startups in the last 25 years. Tesla was absolutely the first one to have as much success as they've had, not just for EV startups, but for car companies in decades. All of that is true. But a number of things that are pointed to in a revisionist history sort of way of wasn't that brilliant and smart and somebody thought of it well in advance, was much more seat of the pants than anybody realizes.
Sure.
So that also to some degree remains true. And we see it in product quality, manufacturing, those sort of, they still have some fairly decent sized open questions, even for all of the success and issues to get arms around. So I do absolutely think they'll eke it out, if not better, but at a minimum, they're going to be around for some years to come. But do they actually get arms around these things to be a truly profitable, not because of weird stock price company, remains to be seen. How much Elon wants to stay involved versus many indications over the last couple of years that he's getting bored potentially, if not other things, and may want to move on. So Tesla's success largely depends on his continued involvement. And the day he decides he's kind of bored with this and done and ready to move on is exponentially more likely Tesla's going to get sold, but also that its success hinges on his direct involvement.
Is there value in Tesla by Ford or Tesla by GM without Elon?
Maybe. I mean, I have long thought that to the degree anyone was going to buy them, it would end up being more of a Trojan horse thing, just like we've seen with Volvo and Jaguar Land Rover, that it would be a Chinese or Indian company. Tata would buy them, Chery would buy them, somebody like that would buy them for the familiar brand value, because no one really realizes that Volvo is a Chinese car, and frankly, no one cares.
Do people buy Volvos anymore?
As many as Volvo wants to sell.
Well, and I have to say, Geely has done an amazing job with Volvo.
Yeah.
The thought was basically Geely would do to Volvo what GM did to Saab.
Yeah.
And they actually let them go off and be Volvo. The one change is that they had to fire 2 CEOs of Volvo before the message came in that Volvo was going to be a luxury brand. Volvos are expensive now. People don't realize it, but they managed to create a kind of a luxury that is different from the 3 Germans and different from whatever Jaguar Land Rover is trying to define itself as. So in that sense, I think Geely has been an excellent steward for Volvo, and Volvo technology or platforms are being used by Geely for domestic market products as well. So I think it's more a question of, if a BYD bought Tesla, that's at least, the day Tesla issues a gasoline car, I think, from its new owners, is probably a bad thing.
Yeah.
But maybe proper costing and industrial controls and assembly and all the rest of that might round off some of those edges. But no one knows.
Right.
It's important to understand how unlikely Tesla is. This is one of the articles I remain proudest of. What was the last time that any group of entrepreneurs in the US founded a car company from the ground up? No government developed assets, that whose brand still exists on the market today.
Chrysler?
Yep. It was Chrysler, and it was 96 years ago.
Wow.
Walter B. Chrysler incorporated his company in December 1924, and since then, no one has done it. I mean, obviously, DeLorean didn't work, and Bricklin didn't work. The one people forget about is Kaiser. Henry J. Kaiser, one of the greatest industrialists of the 20th century, founded a car company in 1946 because he knew with the war over, a whole bunch of GIs were going to come back with a bunch of money in the bank, want to get married and start families and buy new cars, and the domestics had their entire production lines torn out. And he had better relationships with the man in DC who allocated steel than anyone at any of the automakers, because he had been making Liberty ships in Oakland. So Henry Kaiser very smartly said, I'm going to start a car company. He built 700,000 cars from 1946 to 1955. And even he couldn't make it, because once the Detroit makers got their factories up and running, the dealership footprint, the marketing weight they could bring to it just swamped little old Kaiser. So what Tesla has done is astoundingly impressive just to get to where they are.
Right.
I think I've concluded the brand will survive, whoever owns it. I think they might actually get to profitability, but thankfully I don't have to weigh in on that.
Right. Well, it's not that I think they won't, but certainly the last bunch of years have showed it's not a foregone conclusion either. And to Tesla's, more so for Tesla than the others, even things like profitability have been largely dependent on regulation as well. Carb credits to sell and other ancillary services. And so that will remain interesting, as I'm sure, Russell, you have an opinion on, the degree to which Tesla's overall profitability has impact, to what degree does Tesla Energy factor in that versus just the car side and, all of those sorts of things. So there's a bunch of layers that could have varying degrees of impact on this. I mean, I think anyone that goes, I know exactly what's going to happen. Right. Yeah. I think we have a little too much humility for such things to say, I know exactly what will happen here. Occasionally.
It's just a guess. It's okay.
It's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out, but that's the fun part about covering this whole field, right? It's a sea change. It's happening in the rest of the world, and you can make probably more reasonable predictions about how it'll happen in the rest of the world. North America, who the hell knows right now? Go and vote in November.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely vote. However you vote.
Please vote in November.
Well, and maybe a more interesting question for Tesla may be, as this all moves forward, if and to what degree they end up skewing towards same thing, China and Europe and areas that have strong regulation, and they too yank back on the US to some degree, just like the other domestic manufacturers have. At what point do they start to behave like other traditional domestic manufacturers with respect to allocation of resources and marketing interest?
Despite centering the show around a topic that had the word Tesla in it, I didn't really want it to be a Tesla show, but I want to ask you one thing. Do either one of you think Fremont's going to still be building Tesla cars in 5 years?
No.
5 years?
Well, maybe. I think largely it will depend on politics more than anything else. And so the next election or two, I think will have a bigger impact than anything else.
Sure. Sure.
With the greatest of respect, California is a really stupid place to build cars.
That's it. He's cut off. Oh.
The state is, and in specific, where that plant is, the highest and best use of that is some sort of mixed work and residential environment connected up to mass transit, which is to say 78,000 beige stucco townhouses. It's not producing cars.
Right.
But it was a good deal.
Oh, it solved two problems. It solved the problem of Tesla needing a car plant, because weren't they going to go to Phoenix? Was that the original?
There and Long Beach
and LA, yeah.
Long Beach,
money. San Antonio.
And so if someone was willing to hand them a recently decommissioned plant with robots in it that they could repurpose, and it solved the problem for Akio Toyota of not wanting a unionized shop in North America.
Yeah. Because
he got it back from GM after GM went bankrupt. And so it was a lovely, very neat deal. I don't think Akio and Elon are still dating, though.
No.
And
definitely not dating.
Which leads me off into a side story. Chelsea, were you at the RAV4 EV launch in 2012, the drive event?
I don't remember. That's so long ago.
I wasn't.
Well, it was the strangest, because they had the Tesla team and the Toyota team, right?
Oh, for sure. Well, and my husband was basically the prime service technician for the Tesla team on that project.
Well, so he probably can weigh in. The way I remember the story was, Toyota has a process. They have in binders. And so when you build a prototype and something breaks, you fill out a report, you do a root cause analysis, you circulate it around to figure out how you fix it, you propose fixes, you get them voted on. When something breaks on a Tesla prototype, you code all night and try it again the next day. And apparently,
Text Bob, yeah.
or call Bob, yeah, and then call Bob to fix the broken part, yeah. Apparently, those two approaches were supremely painful to try to knit, because the Toyota guys were terrified of Tesla being uncontrolled, and Tesla was ready to throw the Toyota people under the bus for process over product.
I can definitely validate the process differences and the cultural tension that would provide.
Well, and one of the funniest things, so the Toyota product leader was a fairly young guy, and he had dyed brown hair, very unusual for a Japanese rising executive. That's a fairly radical thing to do. And he, toward the end of the evening, he was tired and we were all happy. And he said, you know, I say to my new Tesla friends, do not lose what makes you Tesla. It is special. And I thought that was very gracious, considering they probably made him bang his head on the wall a lot of times.
Oh, for sure. And at the same time, I imagine that some of the Toyota people envied the flexibility with which Tesla operates. And there's, you know, certainly points at which you don't want to fill out the report. You want to walk over, you want to text Bob and go, I need this freaking fixed. What do we do? Break out the number 8 wire and the duct tape.
Yeah, well, but Fremont, in the end, shouldn't be making cars, but I think it will be 5 years from now.
Interesting.
And only because it takes a long time to pull out.
Yes. And they're making all of their North American vehicles there. Now, 10 years from now, maybe they'll make them in Austin and Tulsa.
Right.
I don't know.
I mean, yeah, they have states falling all over themselves to give them $1 billion, right?
Well, no, that's
no.
Texas.
Austin only is giving them $14 million.
14 million. Travis County just came in with what's got to be a disappointing subsidy in the Tesla world.
I don't think these conversations are done, because there's definitely other reports.
Fair enough. But Tesla people also will be willing to move to Austin. Tulsa, I'm not so sure.
I would agree with that. Although they have a much more enthusiastic EV owner base than anyone would ever imagine.
Oh, I believe you, but I'm talking about cultural issues.
Oh, no, we're on the same page.
I think if you talk to some of the people who chose not to move with one of the Japanese automakers that has relocated to a red state,
right?
And there are more than one. In fact, I can make it 3.
Well, certainly there's a huge difference between Nashville and Plano.
Indeed. But both have their
quirks.
Issues. Yes.
Yeah.
From the point of view of a Californian auto engineer.
No question. Heck, my husband worked for Nissan when that move happened.
Oh.
We're still in California.
Yeah.
Well, any final thoughts on this? Any wrap-ups? Any summaries? Any?
No, I think we have to let John go because pizza.
Oh, well, no. But not quite yet. But no, I mean, I think the question of whether there's a middle market for EVs is a valid one. Was it you, Chelsea, or who talked about the trough between the early adopters and the mass market? And I think that remains a concern. You know, we're going to see a lot more hoopla about electric cars starting late this year and for the next 5 years in North America. GM will have these multiple models. Ford will have the Mach-E and some more coming on that platform. The Nissan Ariya, supposedly the volumes on that are going to be higher than people expect. We'll see. I look forward to seeing.
I mean, I found that to be one of the largely uncovered aspects of a few in the last 24 hours of their launch activities. And so my assumption is that they would at least deploy in the US similar to Leaf. So I expect a nationwide car. I expect reasonable volumes. I expect them not to take a massive step back in those things. But at the same time, my main question is, are we talking about early Leaf or late Leaf? Because the degree of interest and support and deployment varied widely in those years.
And the Leaf's best year was 30,000 units, let's be clear.
Right.
Yeah.
But frankly, I'd love to see 30,000 units of the Ariya. That's my point, as opposed to 12.
Yeah.
You know, I've had this written down on my notes here since everybody. So yesterday was the Bronco reveal, the Bronco debut, right? And everyone in auto journalism, of course, which I am up to my chin in, has been Bronco, Bronco, Bronco. And wow, I've never seen so much excitement about Bronco. Why wasn't there this kind of excitement with Rivian? Which, frankly, to me, looks a lot like the Bronco.
Oh, I think there was.
Yeah, Rivian was the absolute breakout hit of the 2018 LA Auto Show, unexpectedly, which is a great story. The challenge with Rivian, I mean, Ford is going to make Broncos. I will put money on the fact that Ford is actually going to build those cars. You can take that to the bank. Rivian is going to, it says, have its first production vehicles coming off the line in early 2021, which is a bit of a delay due to COVID. But a smash surprise debut in late 2018, followed by 2 years of no cars. And I mean, none of us have driven any Rivian working prototypes. You visited the plant, Chelsea. I think you
well, the headquarters, not the plant. And they get very uptight when someone thinks it's the plant. We were in the headquarters.
All right. You visited a company premise.
Yes.
But I think, Rivian, there was a lot of Rivian excitement. They just haven't had anything to report on since then.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree that I think it's a couple of years ago and we've kind of forgotten the hype from, in terms of the 2 days ago impact for Bronco yesterday versus a couple of years ago. But also, in fairness, Ford has, a legacy brand and a broader enthusiast market than Rivian. And so Rivian got all sorts of excitement. And I think probably since the Model S even, you could argue about the Model 3, was the first EV that everybody kind of looked at and went, I want one.
Yes,
From the looks of it, I want one. It's very Jurassic Parky, bring it on. But the difference is Rivian, especially back then, for anyone that wasn't super into the inside baseball of the EV industry, was the first time they've ever heard of them. They've been conditioned to be kind of cynical about EV startups because 99.9% of them never produce a thing, versus a very well-established company that has lots of legacy fans with a sub-brand that has lots more legacy fans. So there's certainly a difference, but I do think that Rivian was the Bronco of the EV space, certainly for the last 10 years.
Yeah, and I would argue it broke beyond the EV space and became a car story or a truck story because it was the first real truck, and they had not only to pick up the SUV,
right,
but to your point, no one in America had heard of Rivian. I bet you 2/3 of Americans, if you say Bronco vehicle, have some awareness.
Sure.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, varying degrees of growing up in one, knowing someone who had one, whatever.
Yeah. So,
not unlike Mustang in that way.
I think Ford's done a very smart thing, and we're seeing more and more from the car makers this bifurcation of utility vehicles into ones that are the car substitutes, like the Ford Escape, and then the butcher, truckier, more testosterone-laden ones on the same platform, like the Escape Sport, the Bronco Sport. And GM has done some of the same thing, and Jeep, they're slicing Jeep ever more finely. So,
and you pointed out, we're seeing this in the EV market as well, the sort of broification of recent EV introductions.
I still have to write that article.
It is very true. And GM obviously didn't give that many details on the 12 or so models they showed, but it was trucks and like, oh, look, a slightly refreshed Bolt. It was all very bro-y.
Yeah, except for a very luxurious Cadillac sedan that will be in volumes of less than 1,000 a year, I believe, and prices of 200,000 a year or something. Good luck with that.
That's just a different stripe of bro, though.
Yeah, well, it was all utilities and trucks to that.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, even the $100,000 Cadillac is, I would argue, a older, richer, more genteel bro. Yes, they'll sell every one of them, no question.
Yeah, in China.
It's, they're all long wheelbase, the sedans.
For the record, GM sells more cars in China than it does in North America now.
And that's the play. That's a fairly thinly veiled play by certainly both of the domestic automakers at this point.
You go where the buyers are. There's a lot of buyers there.
Yeah.
And
are there?
A couple. That's what I hear.
Where we were. All right.
It's what I hear.
Yeah.
That's all I've got. I've been content to listen. No, wait, I've thrown a few things in there just to stir the pot. But any other final thoughts, Chelsea?
No, we did a crap job about appealing to the EV curious, but we did a great job inside baseball. So you and I will chat afterwards, but we had lots of fun.
Next time, a list of questions.
No. The last thing I want is structure. I think it's great just to let it go where it goes and follow these little paths that work our way through our consciousness. I think that's good. And I think that'll be
There's
more
an
interesting.
audience for the three of us hanging out in a corridor and shooting the
shit. Our show is going to allow the occasional shit.
Right.
Absolutely. And if for anyone watching or listening to this show, if you have questions, if you have a topic, send it in. Don't just send your death threats. Send in your questions and your topics.
Please, audience, direct this gentleman.
We may do our best to cover the interesting ones. Now, a lot of them, admittedly, no. Let me just be really upfront.
Certainly, the one thing we can promise is that any topic we take up will be covered candidly.
Amen.
Well done. John, where can we find your work? What are you doing these days? Are you just...
I'm writing for a variety of outlets. Charged EVs, occasionally green car reports. I've had a couple of pieces on the Drive, which is nice because they want big, meaty sort of analyses of things like hydrogen vehicles. I have another outlet coming up, knock on wood. And if you want to find unfiltered mix of old cars, electric cars, and politics, find me on Twitter. John Voelcker, which I need to spell because it's unspellable and unpronounceable. John, V like Victor, Oelcker.
And I want to personally testify that John's one of the best followers on Twitter. He's just really all over the place in the very best possible way.
John is one of the best people in this space on all of the things.
You are far too modest, young woman. All right. Pizza for all three of us.
Pizza for everybody. Chelsea, where can we find you? What anything you want to plug before we say night-night?
Find me on the next episode here.
There we go. And you can follow her, of course, at EVChels on Twitter and the next episode here. So until then, all of you out there, stay curious, and we will see you very soon.